Hey there, I'm John, and today we're going to make a rendering of a 3D model that we made with Metashape using a method called photogrammetry. If you need to see photogrammetry before you do this, because this is the last step of the process, then definitely go watch one of those videos. Hopefully soon I'll have a video on this channel showing how to use a program called Metashape to digitize something using photogrammetry. But today we're going to assume that you've already done that and you want to make it look pretty and export it as an image that you can share on Facebook or Twitter or on a website or what have you. You may not always want to share your 3D model as a 3D model. You might want to make a picture of the 3D model. There are easier ways than this to do it, but if you have the means and the time, there's really just no reason not to. I really enjoy making renderings. We're going to use a program called Blender. This is Blender right here. And I've been using it for about 10 years-ish, something like that. It's a very, very, very powerful program. It may change between now and when you're seeing this video. Hopefully it doesn't, but certainly in the time I've used it, it's gone through several interface changes. The most recent, actually, very recently, we are on edition 2.8. I think 2.82 or something like that. 2.8 was the big revision. Before that, 2.7 was really what I was used to. So you may see me search for something that should be pretty obvious to me, but every once in a while I'll go into 2.7 mode and I'll forget where something is. Now, unfortunately, this program used to have a feature that you could just turn on that was included in it, and I don't think I couldn't find it in the settings. But it used to be so that you, in the bottom left corner, could have on the screen a readout of whatever buttons I was pressing on the keyboard. It was very useful for screen recording like this. Unfortunately, they don't have that in the program anymore, or at least if they do, I can't find it. They must have moved it, or I don't even know. So I'm going to try to tell you what keys I'm pressing. If I don't, I'll try to put a flash. I'll try to flash it on the screen. But yeah, I really wish that was still in Blender, but for some reason I can't find it. So, and then also the screen recording software I'm using, for whatever reason, whenever a new window appears, it doesn't really show that, which is a bit problematic. So I'm going to try to dance around that. But anyway, let's get into it. So again, assuming that you have a model, I would highly recommend that you export your model as an OBJ file or .obj. That, in my experience, is the best way to work with a 3D model. Again, you can do whatever you want. You could export it as whatever you want. There's a drop-down menu here. You can import well, not a whole lot of these are great. So yeah, you can do an OBJ and STL, FBX, WRL. I'd really strongly recommend OBJ though. So we're going to hit delete on our keyboard and get rid of this cube. We don't need the cube. We're not trying to render the cube. That's not the object that we're going for. Now in Blender, and I'm assuming in this tutorial that you are a complete novice, so forgive me if you know a little bit about Blender. I will explain some pretty basic things, but in the 3D space, you move around, you orbit like this by holding down the scroll wheel, tongue twister, on your mouse. You really want to use a mouse with Blender. If you don't have a mouse, I strongly recommend you get one. If you don't have a mouse, you can always, on your numpad, hit 1 to go into front view, 3 side view, 7 top view. And if you hold down Control and hit any of those buttons, you go to the opposite of that view. So if we're on the top now and we hit Control 7, now we're on the bottom, the back, the other side, and now we're back to the front. Also, and this is a very foundational thing, if you, let's say we want to select this lamp right here, which we are going to get rid of. If we left click it like you would in any other program, all that's going to do is move the cursor that was right here up to here. That's not good. And actually we want to hit N on our keyboard. If that happens, that'll pull this up, and then you go into view, and we're just going to reset all of these values right here to 0. and you'll see why in a second. So we actually select something in the 3D view, and really any view. It's good practice in Blender. Select anything with your right mouse button. So something will turn a yellowish orange when it's selected. We're going to go ahead and hit delete, and that'll get rid of that. You can also hit X on your keyboard to delete it. They may have adjusted that. When I upgraded to 2.8, I decided to keep all my 2.7 keyboard shortcuts. So X may not work anymore. I'm actually not quite sure. But it depends what side of the keyboard my hand is on as to which one I press. So sometimes you'll see me hit X, sometimes delete. They do the same thing. So I'm going to import my model. Now you're not going to be able to see this, but when you hit import OBJ, it'll open up a file browser. And I'm opening in. Yeah, so it'll take a while. I have a pretty fast computer. It could be faster, but it is pretty darn fast. But it sometimes depends, especially if you have a very high-res model. It'll take a long time. So we've imported this. You'll see it's a deeper orange than if we selected something else. So if we right-click it again, it'll change to that yellowish orange, and that's what we want. So hit 3 on your numpad, or I guess it depends where your model is. So if your model is way over here, for example, if you're looking at it from the front view, then really you just follow along. I'm not explaining this very well, but hit tab while you have this selected, and you'll need to switch between views. So I started on 3 because the model started way back here, but you might want to start from the top or the front view. So let's put our cursor right here, right into the middle of the object. And we're going to hit G on our keyboard, and we're just going to drag it over here and click. And then I'll bring it to the center of the origin right here. And that's going to make everything way easier if we need to move it later. So let's do the same thing again. And actually, let's center this a little bit better. Okay. So, looking at it from the different views, what we want to do is hit R on our keyboard to rotate. And this model has a pretty flat bottom to it. It's not completely flat, and honestly, that's okay. We're not shooting the picture from the bottom. We're shooting it from above. So even if you don't get it completely level, I really wouldn't worry about it too much. So let's see. That looks pretty good to me. And then let's go ahead and rotate this a little bit this way, yeah. And that way when we adjust the camera later, we can get a better view of it. So we hit tab on our keyboard to go out of edit mode, and we can see that it's pretty well lined up now. It doesn't look like we did much, but it's going to make our lives a lot easier. So let's hit Shift A on our keyboard and add a plane. Now we're going to move our mouse near the middle of this cursor, but not all the way close to it, just kind of close. We're going to hit S on our keyboard, and we're going to drag the mouse out and scale this up quite a bit. That's good. So with it still selected, we're going to hit 1 on the numpad and zoom in, and then hit G. Now G is going to let us move it, but as you can see, we're moving it side to side too, and we don't really want to do that. We only want to move it up and down. So hit Z on the keyboard, and that'll make it so you only drag it on the Z axis. That's a really useful keyboard shortcut. So we want to drag it to the bottom of the model. As you can see, there's a little gap here. Again, unless you're really... actually, we might adjust it. Yeah, how about right there? So yeah, unless you're shooting it, the picture that is, from head on, you're really never going to notice that. So we're going to shoot it from up here, and you really don't need to worry about getting it too close. As long as it's close enough, that's fine. So anyway, we moved the floor. That's what's going to be the floor. Let's scale that up a little bit more, just to be safe. And now we have our model and a floor. So let's add some lights. So this is where this might differ from your computer. So I have an NVIDIA RTX 2070. That's a pretty powerful graphics card. Unfortunately, at the time of filming this, it looks like at the end of the year, they're going to be releasing cards that are way, way better than this one. So I will probably have to pay to upgrade, which I'm not looking forward to. But the technology in them is very exciting because they have a technology that's pretty much designed for video gaming called ray tracing, or RTX. Now, as far as video games go, at the moment, it's not a very useful technology, although it will be later. But for what we're doing, we actually really want to take advantage of that. So if you are considering speccing out a computer, assuming you don't already have one that you're using this on, I mean, if you're watching this video and you want to start from the ground up and really do this the right way, and you want to make renderings on a pretty regular basis, I would strongly recommend that you get a ray tracing card. Blender is CUDA accelerated, so I really like working with NVIDIA products whenever I build a computer. But really, that's up to you and your use case. I mean, maybe Blender is the only CUDA accelerated thing that you do, in which case you might want to go with an AMD graphics card. But generally speaking, for workstation stuff like this, I recommend NVIDIA cards. And for this, I strongly recommend ray tracing or RTX NVIDIA cards. So Eevee is our rendering engine. You can see right here. It's neat because it's a real-time rendering engine, but and if we actually go in here to rendering, it's going to be really dark. Oh no, it's not really dark. That's funny. You can see that we're rendering this in real time using Eevee. Now Eevee is pretty much a video game-ish rendering engine. So it's using a method, I believe, called rasterization. I'm pretty sure it's a rasterizing engine. Someone can correct me if I'm wrong about that, but it's pretty accurate. You know, there are ways to make it look really good and lifelike, but it's never going to be completely photorealistic because you're not really bouncing light around. You're not, as the name would imply, ray tracing. So you're not tracing rays of light. You're not really light bouncing is the thing that makes ray tracing so realistic, among other things. So in the render engine, we're going to move from Eevee to Cycles. Now, Cycles is way slower, but that's okay for what we're doing. So if we go to rendered here, it'll be that'll be pretty dark. But so it's actually being lit by this gray sky right here. That's why we get a tiny bit of ambience. But we don't want to do that. So in the device settings, if you have that graphics card that I was telling you about, I would strongly recommend that you switch to GPU compute instead of CPU compute. Now, you might have to mess with the preferences in the system settings to enable that, but this is going to make your rendering so much faster. I cannot even begin. So I have a Ryzen 3600 as my processor, which is no slouch. It's a pretty capable, good bang for the buck processor. It has 12 threads, which means that you can render, and you'll see this later, 12 of those little squares at a time. I did a test when I built this computer, and I did a render with that processor in about 5 minutes. When I enabled the GPU compute with this ray tracing card, it did that same 5-minute render in, I believe, 18 seconds. So it blew it out of the water. You definitely want to, if you can, you want to use GPU compute. So let's see what's next. So let's create our scene. So let's hit this button up here and make it just regular shading, and that way we're not taxing our card. So let's hit Shift A on our keyboard, and then we're going to add a plane. Hit Z on the keyboard, and that'll make it so that it's a wireframe. Oh my. Okay, well, I don't know why that is up there, but that's actually a good example of why you always want to center the cursor. So wherever that cursor is, if we left click, that's where whatever you add is going to appear. Now that gets really annoying really quickly. So again, I'm just going to show you how to get rid of that. We're just going to zero out these values. Okay, so let's try that again. And we're going to hit R on our keyboard and hold down Control. You don't have to do that, but it just lets you do things in increments. So I can rotate this by exactly 90 degrees. Let's scale it up quite a bit. grab with G on the keyboard, go into top view, rotate it, let's grab it, and then in the material properties down here, hit new, and then emission. Now let's make that about a 3, and then let's go back over here. On your keyboard, hit Shift D, drag the duplicated, Shift D duplicates, duplicated light over here, and then we're just going to rotate it so it just about matches the other one. Oh, I forgot. I always forget this. Go to the Object Properties tab, and in Visibility, uncheck Glossy on both of these. So right-click on the other one, uncheck Glossy. That'll make more sense in a minute. So let's go to 1 on the numpad, and then on your keyboard, press Control-Alt-0. Select your camera with right-click. That's the frame here. So if you select this frame, grab, and then Z-axis, so you want to lift it up. And then something that's really neat is if you want to just look around, you can hit Shift-F on your keyboard, and you can really frame the camera wherever you want. So let's look down like this, and then bring the camera up some more. And then in the camera tab over here, which is this cute little cinema camera logo, we're going to make it a much longer focal length. So let's make it 187. That's about good. So we're going to move the camera up a little bit more. I hit G on my keyboard and then grabbed it, moved it by the Z axis, and hit home on your keyboard, and that'll fill the frame with what your camera can see. We're going to go back, we're going to hit Z on our keyboard and go back to regular shading, and that is what the camera will see. So if we preview the render here, and this is a really low res version of the final render. Look at that. So if we zoom out here, and in your final render you won't be able to see outside of this frame, but we can see these really bright lights, and those are what are emitting the light that create this scene. Now you see it's a little, there are shadows here. Unless you're wanting to make something really moody, we probably don't want that. So, and actually here's a better view of what's happening. So you can see very clearly that these are emitting light, and that light is bouncing around, and there are lots of surfaces here to bounce off of. There are 250,000 vertices in this scene, and actually with photogrammetry you can very easily get a lot higher than that. So anyway, let's add another plane and then scale that up quite a bit. Let's move it up. And then in the object properties, we're going to uncheck glossy one more time. And then we're going to make that another emission. But let's give that a value of 2 instead of 3. So hit 0 to go back to your camera view. And look at that. That's a really smooth, very even lighting rendering. Now if we wanted to make it look really pretty, we can right click on the floor, and then in the material properties tab, hit new, glossy, and usually I like to give this a value of about 0.2. So all of a sudden we have a semi-glossy floor, and that's really going to make it quite attractive. So one last thing, just to really sharpen up the scene and make it look like a much more coherent product, we can go into the world properties, and we can either make the background completely white, or, as I like to do sometimes, we can make it completely black. And on a brighter, this has a lot of white on it, so on a brighter object I really like to make it black, so that way it stands out. And if we look at that, that's a pretty good rendering right there. I mean, it's not a final rendering. We're going to do that in a minute. This is a rough approximation, which is why it's so noisy. You can see a lot of noise here, especially if I zoom in. So, but if you wanted to stop here, frankly, you could, and you'd get a very good result. But I think we can do a little bit better. So let's hit 3 on the numpad, and then Z. So we're not going to be in rendering anymore, and actually hit Z again. And then select the camera. Now, since we changed the focal length, you can see it got much longer. That's because we made the focal length, I think, 187 millimeters. So that's a very long focal length. So in the camera settings right here, we're going to check viewport display. We're going to open that up, and then check limits. So two things are going to appear. This one line that shows the center of the camera. So this is exactly the center of wherever it's looking at. That's very useful if you're animating a scene, which you can do in Blender, but we already know where it's looking, so we don't need to worry about that. What we really need to worry about is this guy right here. Now if we go this way, we can see it's actually a cross. So that'll tell us where the camera is focusing. Now right now, if we go back to rendered view, we can see that every single thing is in focus. So the very front of the object here is perfectly sharp. The very rear of the object is perfectly sharp. Again, you could stop here and it'd be absolutely fine. But when I'm doing this one extra step really adds some photorealism to it. So if you were shooting this with, say, a camera like a DSLR, no matter how far you stop the lens down, however small you make the aperture of the lens, it's always going to have some type of depth of field. I mean, that's just the nature of how lenses work in real life. We can very easily simulate that with the software. So if we hit depth of field, all of a sudden it gets really blurry. And that's because, as we can see here, the depth of field, the plane of focus, as it's called, is really far away from the object. So if we move that closer to the object, and actually let's zoom in here using our scroll wheel, and let's move it to about there. It'll be different for you, really, wherever you want to focus it. So it's really up to you. But I think that, so that we're focusing on that surface right there, and then that surface. Lots of detail. This front part should be slightly out of focus, and this rear part will be out of focus too. So let's go back to camera view, and then rendered viewport shading. It'll take a second, and you'll not notice much of a difference. And that's because this software is really, honestly, really accurate in how it handles the control you have over depth of field. So you can see we have an f-stop of f2.8. We can move that down to something really dramatic just to show you the effect, like 0.1. And you can see that the back of the object is super out of focus, the front of the object is out of focus, but this plane of focus right here is really sharp. Now this is way too out of focus, so let's make the f-stop 0.3. Yeah, that's good. 0.3. You can see that it's very subtly out of focus in the back. It's very subtly, this is probably the foremost point of the front point of the object. This is very gently out of focus. Generally speaking, the whole thing is pretty sharp, but it does have some fall off. And that's how, if you were taking a picture of it, that's how it would look in real life. So we added some photorealism to it a little bit. It's not super photorealistic, this thing, the setup, just because, who shoots a photo on a surface like this with a completely black background? You could do this in real life, but it does seem like a strange photo. So there are ways to make it more photorealistic. You could certainly spend more time on this and create a more realistic scene for it with better lighting. But this is just the easiest, quickest way to get something that looks really good. I mean, we're getting pretty good detail in the object here, and I'd be happy with this. And I frequently make renderings that look like this, and sometimes they take some tweaking, but this is pretty quick and easy. I mean, we're 20-something minutes into this video, and we've already made something that I'm pretty happy with. So let's go back, hit Z on the keyboard, and go back to regular viewport shading. And then in the Render Properties tab, we're going to do something cool here. So this is completely going to be different for you if you don't have the same setup that I do hardware-wise on my computer. If you don't have ray tracing enabled video cards, then for a scene like this with glossiness and reflections, I'd say that on the Render Sampling tab, you should set that to about 1200. That will take a really long time to render, but it'll give you a really smooth result. So you can see here, actually let me show you in real time. So let's turn the preview samples down to 10. And let's reload that actually. Okay, so you can see that it's very, very rough, and it really looks quite bad. It's very noisy. That's because we have a low sample setting. So sampling is how many times the computer looks at a given pixel and processes or estimates what that would look like in real life. That's a very rough definition of rendering sampling, but that's generally what it is. So the higher the number, the higher the quality. That's effectively all you need to know. So let's turn that up to 100, and that'll take a minute more for sure. But you can see here that it's actually, you see those dots are quite a bit smaller. The grain is much finer in the image. So we can see that as we turn the sampling up, we get a much cleaner image. But I don't want to spend the time that it would take to render 1200 samples. I mean, we could, just for argument's sake, let's turn that up to 500. And that'll still be on my hardware pretty quick. It might not be as quick on your hardware. But you can see here up in the top, we're only about halfway through that now. But, I mean, look at this grain. It does look a lot better. So let's turn that back down to 32. I think that's a reasonable number. And let's turn this down to 100. Actually, no. Let's do 200. Since I have a ray tracing enabled video card, we can go into layer properties, which is a very strange place to put this setting. I would argue it should be either in output or render properties, but for some reason it's in this tab. You scroll down to the bottom and you check denoising. So what that's going to do is it's going to look at this grain and it's going to kind of smooth it out. Now, you can very easily overdo this, so you do need to do enough samples. That's why we did 200, right? So if you tried it with 10 samples, it would kind of look kind of blurry. But with 200, it has enough detail there that the computer can go, I think this is what happens between these pixels, and it kind of smooths it out. But if we want it to go really quickly and actually be much more accurate, then we check, if you have a ray tracing enabled card, optics AI denoising. Now that's going to get rid of all your settings here, but that's okay. We don't need those because the optics AI denoising is going to do an amazing job. So we're pretty much ready to go. So let's hit Z just to make sure it's not running in the background. And then F12 on our keyboard. Now, for me, I need to pull up the image editor so that you can see this, because it pulls it up when you hit F12. It pulls it up in a separate window, and my screen recording software won't let me show you that. But you can see here in real time how it's kind of grainy, and it very quickly denoises it. So look at that. We have a finished, it took 21 seconds. That's not long at all. It took 21 seconds to render that, and that's in 1080p. Actually, I completely forgot. We need to go into the output tab. So I like to do everything in 4K. So I move that, that's 1080p settings right there. So I move that up to 400%, and that's pretty much 4K. So let's actually re-render that. And yeah. Oh, goodness gracious, I'm forgetting everything today. So if you're using your CPU, your processor, to render, first of all, you'd see many more of those squares than just one. I only have one graphics card in my system, which you probably do too. Most people do. But it's very complicated. Frankly, I don't even understand all the math behind this. But to make a long story short, if you go into the render properties right here, when you're using a CPU, it has a bunch of those little squares. So in my case, it would have 12 going all at once. And with a CPU, it makes more sense to, to have smaller tiles. I've tested this myself. Other people have too. For whatever reason, and I'm sure there is a reason, so someone out there can explain it to me. When you use a graphics card to render your image, you want to make the tiles much bigger. So we can see here that the tile is 64 by 64 pixels. Now with a CPU, that's ideal, but with a graphics card, we want to bump that up to 256. A 256 pixel square, for whatever reason, is the sweet spot with GPU rendering. So let's try this one more time. I promise that's the last thing I forgot. Now those squares, you see that square is a lot bigger. But so this will take a little bit longer. It'll take much more than 21 seconds, but it should only take about 4 times that, since we did 400% resolution. It doesn't scale perfectly, so it'll probably be a little bit different. But anyway, after this is done, you have a finished render, and you could stop here if you wanted. And yeah, I mean, I don't have much more to say about this particular method. I am going to show you one more method though. It's really neat, and it'll make a lot more sense when I actually show it to you. But let's assume, so what I do for my job is I do photogrammetry of historic artifacts at institutions that are local to me, so museums and stuff like that. Sometimes that museum might want to show what we've digitized on their website, or anywhere. And a really cool thing we can do is we can take a 360-degree panorama of the environment that, for example, if we shot this in like a ballroom, for example, in an older house, we could take a 360-degree panorama, and we can use that not only to light the scenes, we can get rid of all of our lights, but we can also make it so that that's what you see in real time when you are looking around the image on an online service such as Sketchfab. So I'm going to cut the video right here and just skip to when this render is finished. It'll just take a minute, and then I'll show you how to save this, and then we'll go ahead and do that other method. And it's really neat, and it doesn't take that long at all. It's actually kind of, I would argue, it's kind of the lazy way to do what we just did, but it's good to know both ways. So I'm going to cut the video right here, and I'll see you in just a second. All right, so that took about 4 3/4 minutes, but the result is really good. So we can zoom in here with the scroll wheel, and we can see there's still lots of detail in here. We are only rendering at 4K, which is still pretty high res, but for an image, we can actually do better. But I don't, just for the purposes of this video, I don't want to take more than 5 minutes to do this. But anyway, we can see some really cool stuff here. So we can see in greater detail now the fall off from the depth of field. That's a really subtle but really photorealistic effect. That really carries the image, I would argue, to the next level. And as we saw before, the very, very front of the model is just very gently out of focus. So we don't really lose a whole lot of detail. And of course, all the detail is still there in the original model. You're just doing this rendering so that it looks pretty. So we can stylize it however we want. And that's something I really like to do. It really adds some photorealism to the finished product. We can also see that this reflection is very detailed right next to the object, but as it trails off, it loses a lot of detail. And that is how it would happen in real life. So, because this is all out of focus, and it's also farther away from the object. So really, ray tracing with Cycle's rendering engine in Blender is, gosh, you can just create some really beautiful results here. But anyway, if you want to export this, it's really easy. Now that you've made the rendering, you go up to Image, Save As, and then you can just save it wherever you want. It'll pull up a file browser. It'll give you an option to save it as a JPEG or PNG or what have you. And you can just save it wherever you want. So you're finished. Or you can do this second way of doing it. So let's go back to the 3D viewport. In your case, since it pulled up a separate window, most likely you can just hit Escape on your keyboard and it'll take you back to this. So let's hit 0, just look around, and I'm going to delete all these. And actually I'm going to delete the floor too. And I'm going to select the camera. And I'm going to uncheck depth of field, and that'll just make everything way easier. You'll see why in a second. So let's go to the shading tab. If you don't have that tab, hit the plus sign, general, and then shading. So let's go into the shading. Okay, so down here where it says object, select world in the drop down menu. And then, actually, we skipped a step. Go and you can't see this on my screen because it won't show a pop-up window, but you need to go into Edit, Preferences, and then in the Add-on tab of the Preferences window, you need to hit Search and look up Node, N-O-D-E, Wrangler, and then hit the check mark next to that and enable it. And that is the easiest shortcut by a significant margin to what we're about to do. So do that, and then come back to this. And then the other thing you're going to do actually before we proceed is you're going to need that 360 degree file. You can also just use a generic stock photo HDRI file. They're called HDRI images from a stock HDRI website. There are a few of those. They all have really cool free stuff that you can use. So check that out. Experiment with it. You can, of course, use your own, but I'm just going to use one that I found online just for the purposes of this. So right-click on the background node right here, and you can hit G to move these nodes around. After you've selected the Node Wrangler add-on, so you can go back to this, right-click this, make sure World Output isn't selected, just the background. And on your keyboard, press Control-T. Now we're going to clean this up and drag them over here. And now, literally all you have to do is hit Open, which for me, I mean, you can't see what I'm doing, but it opened up a new window. And you're going to select... Oh, nope. Whoops. I selected the wrong one. You're going to select an HDRI file. You can use a non-HDRI file. It just has to be a 360 degree spherical image that you can make one on your phone. You can make one with a special camera. You can really do whatever you want. Oh my goodness, I can't find it here. There we go. Okay, so that's all loaded in. So if we preview the render, we can see all of a sudden, the one that I used was of the woods, because I think that's a very good example of how this works. All of a sudden, look at that. Our object is being lit by the environment. So you can see up here, the sky is lighting it, and it's nice and bright. There is light bouncing off of the green grass, though. So we go down here, and we can actually see that is affecting the otherwise white color of the plaster. So that's really neat, right? Like that's a very environment. That's a very interesting way that a model can interact with the environment. So one of the places that I've shot photos for a museum was in the museum's ballroom before. It'd be really neat, right? If you could if you could digitize a model that was in a ballroom, for example, and then when you show someone that model, they see it in the ballroom, and the ballroom actually with its chandeliers or whatever is what lights the object. That is an incredibly immersive way to view something, and it's actually also, as it happens, a very convenient way to render. If we hit F12, you can see it might actually finish even before. Let's see, image editor. Yeah, see, it's going really quickly. But anyway, that's a very convenient way to light. So it's being lit by the sky, and then the sky is bouncing off the grass in that photo and the trees, and that modified light, that bounce light, is bouncing onto this object, and it's lighting it in very dynamic ways. If you upload your model to a service like Sketchfab or something like that, you can, and I'm going to hit escape here. We don't need to keep rendering this. You know what it looks like. Let's see. Is it going to work? Oh, no. It froze up on me. Oh, there we go. Okay. Anyway, the services like Sketchfab, and I strongly recommend Sketchfab. I think that's a tremendous way to share 3D models online for free, even. You can actually do this. You can upload your own HDRI or environment image file, and you can have people immersed in a way in your 3D model that they might not otherwise be able to be. Now, if we switch this over actually to Eevee, we get pretty much the same lighting effect, right? And this is what you'd see on Sketchfab, is a rasterizing type render engine. And all of a sudden, we don't have that lag whenever we move it around. It's real time, which is really cool. So I was using cycles just because that's what I like. But if you wanted to preview what it looks like to do this method with an online service like Sketchfab, this is what it would look like. And it's real time, and it's really a very, very immersive way to introduce your 3D model to someone who wants to see it. So the possibilities of this are beyond what I could even talk about in a video. And we're about 40 minutes here, so I might as well cut it short now. So anyway, if you have any questions, do leave them in the comment section of this video. I'll try to answer those. But this is a, pretty, basically you can render any image or any model you want using the methods that I outlined here. You should definitely go play with it yourself. It's definitely worth just experimenting with. You really can't break anything, right? So if you mess up, just go to File, New, and start over, or Control Z to undo. This is a very non-destructive way to look at your models, and you can make some really beautiful stuff. I mean, you can do anything in Blender, frankly. I mean, you can animate your models, you can manipulate them, you can clean them up if the photogrammetry or however you digitized it left some weird artifacts on it. You can clean it up in Blender. You can do a whole lot in Blender. I showed you the very basics of just one of the things you can do. So anyway, again, if you have any questions, let me know. But thanks for watching this really long video. I'm very proud of you if you watched to the end. And anyway, I'll see you guys in the next one.